You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Rootbound is brought to you by Black Locust. It's a tree, not a bug.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Rootbound. I'm the host of the show, and my name is Steve, and Rootbound is the podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. Each week, I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that's meaningful to them, and then I share with the guest about a plant that is meaningful to me, and through this process, we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. It is the philosophy of Rootbound that everybody has at least one plant that is meaningful to them because plants are so integral to our lives as humans on this planet. Now, before I meet our guest today, I want to do a little bit of vocabulary, which I haven't done in a little while, and it's because I mentioned a word later in the show, and I think I didn't quite get the definition, actually a couple words. I think I didn't quite get those definitions quite right, so I wanted to go over them now so I get them in my brain, and maybe you can get them in your brain too. So first, I just want you to imagine a fall leaf and that you're holding the fall leaf in your hand and you're holding it by that little stem that comes down from the leaf. Now, that stem is actually not a stem. It's one of the words that I'm going to talk about. It is a petiole. That is what that little stem that comes from a leaf, which is not a stem, it is a petiole. The petiole connects to the stem. And so keep that in your mind. That's a petiole. I wanted to define that. That's one thing. And then the other word that I mentioned later on is the word pulvinus, Pulvinus. And I mentioned that this is I say that it is a kind of petiole, but it's actually a part of a petiole of some plants. A pulvinus is a swollen region on a petiole that can help a plant to move a leaf in relation to the sun or some other stimulus. It can help move the leaf. So that's what a pulvinus is, and that's what a petiole is. And not all plants have petioles. If you think a blade of grass has no petiole. The leaf is just coming straight out of the ground. So there is a term to define that. A leaf that has no petiole is apetiolate, and a leaf that has a petiole is a petiolate leaf. So those are the words I wanted to define for you. And with that, let's speak with our guest.
Here's that sunrise serenader, Frankie Carl, playing his latest composition, Falling Leaves.
Hi, Enoch. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It's great to be here with you.
You're very welcome. Do you have a plant to share with us today?
Yes, today I'm talking about Chlorophytum comosum, and this is commonly known as the spider plant. Now, the
Awesome.
the spider plant's really an important plant to me in my whole growing experience, as it was basically the very first plant that I got to grow. And this takes me back to when I was about, I would say about 7 or 8 years old. And my mother had just a great wide collection of plants. And I just remember I was always fascinated following her around the house, whether helping her watering them or all that sort of stuff from a very young age. But I remember that she had this just really crazy plant that had all of these cool, straight leaves that just popped right out of it.
Yeah, I was gonna say that the spider plant. You're describing it now, and I was like, I'm pretty sure that's one. I as a lot of listeners will know, I'm actually not much of a houseplant guy. As for a guy having a plant podcast, but it's that one that kind of looks like it kind of looks like somebody's crazy hair coming out in all directions,
Yeah,
or like a basket
exactly.
of really wild grass, but kind of thick grass or something, right?
Right. Like if you caught yourself in a picture just the right way with it behind you, it would look like you had like this crazy sprawling hair
Like you got
coming out of the top of
electrocuted.
your head. Right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very, very good. Oh, can
Yeah.
you say that Latin name one more time? That's also I realized I don't think I've ever heard that one before.
It's Chlorophytum comosum.
Good.
Yeah. I
All
didn't
right.
even think about the Latin name until the podcast, but I thought I better look it up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
But yeah, it's again too. They also call it spider ivy or airplane plant is another couple of names for it as well. But again, when I was young, that plant just fascinated me so much by how it sprawled out and what it did. But one of the cooler things about the spider plant, I think, and I think what really fascinated me about this plant in particular when I was younger, was that when the spider plant reproduces, it sends out a stem, and it shoots a stem out, and at the bottom of the stem is a bunch of little plantlets, they're called, little spiderlets. And
that's
so
cute and disturbing at the same time.
exactly, right? So here you got this one big plant, and then it's got a whole bunch of, and I mean, it puts on a ton of baby little spider plantlets. And I just remember just being so fascinated with that, and that was like one of my mother's first lessons in teaching me in growing and all that from this young age. And I remember taking one of those or taking me to the plant and letting me just pluck off that little plantlet. And at the very bottom of it has like little tiny nodes. And she showed me how if you put it in just a little glass of water, that those nodes will form roots. And then a couple of weeks later, we're taking it out of the water and putting it in a pot, just a little pot. And that was one of the very first plants that I had in my own bedroom, in my own space, and I just remember that plant there for, I mean, probably until I was probably until I was a teenager at least. And, it grew big. It produced its own babies eventually and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, that just brings back a lot of really great memories of that plant and everything. And yeah, I just really love that plant. And I've got maybe about 3 or 4 of them around the house, and a couple of different varieties. There's 2 basic varieties of them. Yeah.
I was going to mention, so this is not a video podcast, but I can see Enoch's wonderful background, which is full of plants. Is there a spider plant right behind you, or am I misidentifying that? Right above
there.
on the right there.
Yep.
Uh-huh.
Yep. The main plant right up here.
Yeah.
And all the plantlets. There's probably about 100 of them right here in a bunch.
Wow, those are bigger than I thought. I guess. Wow, that looks really cool.
Well, there's about 100 of them, so it looks like a big old bunch together. But,
Looking at it in the background, I thought it was like 2 different plants at 2 different levels, but now I see
Yes.
how it's like the main plant, and then there's kind of like looks like they're dangling a little bit, and then these little tiny versions. Really neat.
Yeah, it's just a really fascinating way of reproduction for the plant, and a really cool lesson on plant propagation as well that I got to learn with such an easy one, because they're just really easy. You pluck one of those little things off, you stick it in a little glass of water like I mentioned, and then a couple weeks later you got some roots. And in fact, I've even just taken them right off the plant and stuck them right into soil without even water too, and had them succeed as well. So I mean, they're just so easy to propagate, and just a really beautiful plant. When they get full grown, you get this little tiny plantlet, and then literally a year later it's this big massive plant. And yeah, I just love them. And again too, there are a couple of varieties. I think the one that I've got, and you can tell they either have white on the edges with green down the middle, or there's white down the middle with green on the edges.
Oh, interesting.
And so I got both of those varieties around here. So
Very cool. Now, one question I have before we get into dazzling details about this is, I think it sounds like your experience with, like, I had houseplants when I was a kid, but for some reason I wasn't, well, I guess I was interested into it, but it sounds like you had like a deeper interest at a younger age than maybe I did, and maybe I don't know, maybe that's not as common, or it sounds
Right.
like you were like very into plants even from a young age.
Yeah, well, my growing story probably started well before I was even, even alive, I suppose. Both of my parents, my mother just loved house plants. She just had tons of them. In fact, I mean, you're looking at my background. I probably have more than she had back then, but she had a good amount of a collection herself. But my father was also a horticulturalist as well. I remember being young, even years before propagating that plant, going to his college nurseries with him as he was studying horticulture and all that sort of stuff. And he tells me stories of how I would repeat those Latin words for all of these plants better than he could at this young age. I'm not that good with them now. I mean, I may have been able to come up with chlorophytum comosum because of looking it up online, but the Latin names kind of evade me a bit when it comes to a lot of the plants. But
well, that's a theme on the show.
I do have that deeper experience, I suppose, that was kind of just given to me by my parents.
That's really interesting. There's a common phrase we say on this, which was coined by my friend Max many episodes ago, which actually seems to not apply to you, but that phrase is botany comes with age. And I feel like the older I get, the more like interested in plants, and I think there's a commonality about people like getting really into plants. But that's interesting.
I've had, and I carried this interest for plants, from that young age, and always have had like a handful of house plants. But there was a break in my adult life. I got to be my early 20s and all the way through my 30s. Were kind of like, I didn't do much with plants. I always had, like I said, had a handful of them. But man, when I started getting older, got into my 40s, all of my interest towards plants just doubled, tripled, quadrupled. I got a ton of these indoor house plants, but my real love is outdoor vegetable gardens and things like that as well too. So, but again, just it's just something that kind of comes with how I was brought up. But also, just again, it's something that lives inside of myself, as well too. That there's this just love for green, growing things.
Well, I guess the botany comes with age does hold true. It can get more intense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. It intensifies.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about some fun facts and dazzling details about the spider plant, Chlorophytum. Oh, I missed the last one. Darn
Comosum.
Comosum. There we go.
Yeah, Chlorophytum comosum. Again, too, it's details about it. It's, again, what do they say? It's a tropical plant. I think it's more native to I think Africa is what I was reading about. So it's really like a native plant there. Again, too, it grows in this big array of leaves that are just straight. Unlike your more, I don't know, you say rounded or heart-shaped leaves that a lot of plants are. It's kind of like almost like a palm in a way, but growing from the ground without the palm trunk, and so that kind of makes it a unique plant in itself. And then, as I talked about, the way it propagates, I mean, I think that's probably one of the more unique thing it does. I don't know if you've ever grown the hennin chicks. It's
it's a succulent, right?
A succulent, yes.
I've not. I've seen it, and I talked about it. I have a couple Echeveria, which I think sometimes those are called hennin chicks. But yeah, I know what you're talking about.
So if you've seen those, and if you know those, then you're familiar with kind of how they put out that stem and bring out their little plantlets, and that's how they propagate and send those out. So for a spider plant, actually, we have them hanging in these baskets, but they would be growing ground level, and those stems would push their way out horizontally along the ground level, and then those plantlets, as they came out, would just kind of again start setting roots and set up a new plants maybe about a foot or so away, so that they could spread out. And so this plant could completely spread itself out all over the place if it was allowed to grow ground level and do that. So,
very interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. Now, one thing, I just was Googling this because I wanted to look at this plant a little bit, and I pulled up his Wikipedia. And the first thing I was thinking, because it looks a little bit like grass,
Yes.
I was wondering if it was a monocot or a dicot, which I don't know if that terminology is in your brain. But most grasses are monocots, which means when they sprout, it's just one leaf. As the dicots sprout, they have
Yes.
two. They have two, and apparently it is a monocot, which is interesting. So it's like it is in the grass
Yeah.
world.
That would. Yeah, exactly. I guess that was the one that was evading me was when I was trying to describe it, was that it looks like this kind of bunch of grass that's coming up out and sprouting out.
And then the other thing that popped up, which I'm spoiler alert, I'm going to talk a little bit about this during my plant, is when we talk about houseplants, we don't talk about flowers that often. I think because houseplants, because of their habit, don't. But the first thing that pops up in Wikipedia is a little picture of a flower of the spider plant. I wonder, have you ever seen a flower on any of your spider plants?
Yeah. In fact, the plant behind me flowered last year.
Oh, cool.
Just the right conditions. That's the thing about house plants. Conditions just kind of sometimes have to be just right, and you never know when. But and then they'll start sprouting their flowers. But yeah, there are again these little little white flowers. Again, similar to the plant, has these cool petals that are long petals that come up out of it, and just really cool, neat little flowers, and they'll grow along those stems that the little plantlets grow off of.
Interesting. And how many flowers did you see?
I had a couple of stems that produced flowers, and it probably had maybe about 3 or 4 per stem.
Oh, wow. That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
So cool. Yeah, I'm trying to think, like I said, I'm not much of a houseplant person, and I haven't had many houseplants, but I don't think I've ever had a flowering houseplant. It's like, I feel like that's how you know you're like a real houseplant person, is when you've had multiple houseplants flower.
Yeah, and you're keeping your conditions indoors right. You're getting it just like I said. A lot of the house plants have to have those specific conditions in order to flower, and it always surprises me. I've got dozens of varieties of different house plants here, and a lot of them, when they flower, I have no clue that they even could produce flowers most of the time. So, and it was the same with that spider plant as well. I'd never seen flowers off of it until last year.
Yeah, I've talked about this a few times, and it's one of those things that it should be obvious, but like the vast majority of plants that we interact with, there's exceptions to this, of course, but the vast majority of plants are flowering plants, and they all have some sort of flower. But when we talk about houseplants, we don't ever think about it because, like I said, it's that conditions thing, and they're growing in a condition that they don't. And most of them are tropical, and tropical plants tend to have these habits of being able to flower because they don't have seasons. They don't have the seasonal flowering. They have more of like, I flower when the time is right habit. And so because of that, I think people forget that houseplants also have flowers. It's just not something you normally see in houseplant conditions.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you do, it's really cool, and a very, like we said, a very good sign that you're doing things just right.
Very good. Well, do we have any other fun facts or dazzling details about spider plant that we missed?
Not too much that I can think of, other than I think one of the other kind of cooler things about them too is part of them that you don't actually see. And I was just seeing this as I was looking at it too, and it made me think of it, is that looking at it online, these roots, and some plants do this sort of thing, is they kind of create these larger water roots to hold in water, and it's kind of one of these cool spider plants do that as well too. And I noticed this. I always wonder, and I used to wonder anyways, if there was anything wrong with the plant because it had these big swollen roots whenever I would transplant them. But I think that's kind of cool how that keeps them kind of really, again, too kind of drought tolerant in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
I've forgotten a couple of the plants and gone back to completely dry soil and still had really vibrant plants. And I think that's really one of their ways of survival, is to be able to store that water in the roots.
Yeah, what a great adaptation for the wild, but also a great adaptation for a houseplant. Probably why it's such a popular houseplant, right? Because it's
hard to kill.
Uh-huh.
In that sense, it's hard to kill, and that's one of those, a lot of things that people are looking for when they're looking for houseplants is, what's the hardest to kill, the easiest to grow, what can I have growing in my house that I don't have to pay too much attention to, and spider plants are definitely one of those, and that's one of the reasons why is that they can handle your negligence. Or mine anyways, not yours.
Darling, you is just like a spider, always somewhere trying to build a well. Darling, you is just like a spider, always somewhere trying to build a well. What you got on your mind ain't no man any word can tell.
Well, very good. Thank you for sharing about spider plant with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Awesome. Yeah, I'd love to hear about it.
Okay, so I mentioned I'm not much of a houseplant person, and I currently have 3 houseplants. 2 are succulents, which I don't know if those even count. They're like their own category. I mean, they are, but they're succulents are their own category. And I talked about those in a previous episode. The Echeveria, very common succulent. But the only other houseplant I have, which I acquired just about a year ago, is a rattlesnake plant. I'm looking in your background. I don't think I see a rattlesnake. I see some snake plant in the background, which is confusing. But rattlesnake plant is a different plant. And I got this plant last year. There was a thing called DC Plant Week where a bunch of plant shops were kind of like getting together and promoting things. It was kind of like Restaurant Week, but for plants. And they had this kickoff event, and I went down there, and I was like, I should buy a houseplant. I'm not really into houseplants, and so I asked one of the owners of the shops down there what I should get. And my biggest issue is, which we talked a little bit on kind of the in-between space here. One of the reasons I don't have houseplants is because I have cats. I have 3 cats. And and I don't want them to eat anything toxic. But then if it's not toxic, they have a tendency to destroy it. And so I did have a really nice parlor palm for a while, for example, but they just eventually just shredded it to pieces. So I was asking, what's a good non-toxic plant for cats? And she pointed me to the rattlesnake plant. And I was like, wow, you're looking at a picture now. It is a stunning plant.
It really is, yeah.
And I'll describe it a little bit here. So it's basically kind of looks like leaves shooting out of the ground. So there's like an underground root structure, but it kind of looks like individual leaves shooting out of the ground. And those leaves are kind of long and oval. And on the front, or on the top, however you say it, and this is why they're called rattlesnakes plant, it has this, it kind of looks like the pattern of a snake skin. So there's this alternating pattern of lighter greens and darker greens that look like a snake skin. On the back, it is this beautiful dark maroon color, which is something you don't see in plants very often.
Yeah, I have a philodendron that does that red kind of thing on the backside. That's just really awesome, and those kind of colors just really make great accents for your house. But yeah, I'm looking at a picture of this, and it is just an amazing looking plant. I've seen it before. I don't have any of these here in my houseplant collection, but like you said, it's really stunning, growing in that similar type of fashion as we were talking about with the spider plant, coming right out with these sprawling long leaves, and except for they're just a bit fatter.
And then they have they are a dicot, I believe, and so they do have the, what's that? Oh man, I nailed they do have a petiole, right? So that's the place where the stem meets the leaf.
Yep.
Whereas spider plant is just like long individual strands.
Yep, exactly.
Now that petiole is actually this, and botanists, if I'm not saying this right, I apologize, but I think I understand this now. The petiole, which is if you think about a leaf, that part where the stem meets the leaf is the petiole. On a rattlesnake plant, that petiole has evolved into something called a pulvinus. And we've talked about pulvinus, actually, I think on the first episode of the show. The pulvinus is a adaptation that allows the plant to make relatively rapid movement. In the case of the first episode, we talked about the Mimosa pudica, which is the plant that when you touch it, it like closes up. The rattlesnake plant doesn't move that fast, but the rattlesnake plant is what is often called in the houseplant world as a prayer plant, and that's because the leaves fold up. And so it's all sprawled out in the daytime, but in the nighttime they fold up and they're all up straight, and so they kind of look like hands coming together to pray. I think that's why they call it a prayer plant, because it folds up at night. And the other thing about it, which is really interesting, is it not only folds up at night, but every time you come into the room throughout the day, it's in a different position. So it's kind of like moving throughout the day very slowly.
Oh, that's great.
And I've been meaning to do a time lapse of it. Maybe I'll get around to that before this episode's up, or maybe I'll do it for like a reel at another time. But it really seems to be quite active. And I think actually right now it's winter, and so it's really responding to light, and the light doesn't change that much in the house right now. So I've noticed it's not quite as dancey at this time of year.
Yeah.
But it does do that. Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, that was kind of what I was going to say. Is it that it closes up at night or that it opens up during the day?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? In that sort of sense. And I think that's kind of the point there you're saying is with the light changes that you're seeing and how it's opening and closing based on the light that it's getting. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, because I'm looking at a picture here too, and again, it's really stunning the colors and the way these variegations work in the leaf pattern here. And from what I'm seeing from the picture, and I can't quite tell because I'm looking at some of the edges of the leaves too. Are they really wavy leaves? Or is that an effect of the actual coloration and variegation?
They're a little, that's a good question actually. I think they're a little wavy, but I think they're a little wavy, but the effect of the variegation amplifies that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It looks like it's just got all these really cool ridges and waves going through the leaf. But on some other parts it looks pretty straight too, and then you can see the coloration. So but again, I've got to find one of these for my collection. And again, grows similar too. I've got another one where people can't see with it because it's audio, but in the background I got this one here too that kind of grows in that same sort of way that you're talking about. And
what is that one?
Similar thing. Oh gosh,
it's not a calathea, is it?
You know what? I think you might be right.
Okay, because that gets into a fun fact and dazzling detail here, which is the Latin name for this plant. It has two, and one is apparently now more correct in the world of naming things. What's that? Yeah. But most commonly, and actually the little tag that was in my plant when I bought it said it was a rattlesnake plant, Calathea. However, it is more accurately known as a Gupertia. And so basically, Calathea is a genus, has a bunch of different plants in it. A lot of Calatheas have rounder leaves, but have a similar patterning on the front and maybe on the back. But at some point, relatively recently, they decided that about 200 species within Calathea were actually a separate genus and they named it Gupertia because somebody a long time ago identified them as. There was a time when everyone was just trying to name plants, and they're like, I'm going to name it this, and I'm going to name it this, and then basically what happens is whoever named the plant first got dibs. So even though they were misnamed for a long time, when they realized they needed to separate by the rules of nomenclature, they had to go back to the first name that plant had. Which Gupertia is one of those ones I talk about in the show a lot. Is where it's just named after a guy named Heinrich Guppert. And so he's a German guy, and somebody wanted to honor him, and so they named this plant after him, and so now the genus is named after him. Calathea, by the way, is for Greek for basket, because a lot of the Calatheas in their native Brazil are also used to make baskets.
Yeah, you could see that with the larger plant. Mine's pretty small at the moment, but with those stems and the plants like that, that'd be something that they could be used for.
Yeah, and there's some bigger ones too. Yeah, there's some bigger versions of bigger Calatheas in the genus that are probably more suited to that kind of work. So that's why the genus. Yeah,
mine's still just pretty young, so.
Yeah, and so that's the two names of it. So the specific names. So Originally, people called this one Calathea lancifolia, which is lancifolia means lance-shaped leaves, so those longer leaves. Because I think a lot of Calatheas at the time, when they thought it was Calathea, have rounder leaves. Now it is called Guppertia insignis, and insignis in Latin means remarkable, which I think is very true.
Oh, right.
It's a remarkable plant. Okay.
It is a remarkable plant, and one of the things I was checking out here too is it also flowers, like we were talking about with the spider plant.
And I was so this is okay. I'm trying to like organize my thoughts here. This is one thing I'm so interested in houseplants, even though I don't have a lot. I'm interested in the houseplants, and I'm interested in what their habit is in the wild, which is shockingly hard to find on the internet. Like, I was trying to find pictures of this plant in its native Brazil, and I even tried trying to figure out its name in Portuguese, which in Portuguese it's called Maranta cascavel, which cascavel is the Portuguese word for rattlesnake, which it has to do with the bell. That's actually, in Spanish, cascavel means like jingle bell, and so cascavel in Portuguese has to do with the rattle. And also Maranta is the family that it's in, and used to, well, even longer before they called it Calathea, they called them all Marantas, and so this is a rattlesnake Maranta in Portuguese. But even Googling that, I found a few pictures of it in like some botanical gardens in Brazil, but I want to see like what it looks like in the jungle, you know, amongst all of its peers. And it's so interesting how we have houseplants have been separated from their like origins in a way where it's really hard to figure out, like with a lot of them. Some of them that's not true, but a lot of them it's really hard to like figure out like what their habit is in the wild, because there's just most of the documentation, at least on like surface level Google, is all about the houseplant care and not about the wildness. But the flowers are a good example of that. They don't flower very often like a lot of houseplants, but they have these little yellow or white flowers, and they stay really low by the base of the plant, which is pretty interesting.
That's kind of what I was seeing here, and I wasn't too sure because, again, too, it's what you're talking about with the name. What I'm seeing here is another Calathea. It says rattlesnake plant, but it's showing the flower, and it's as you describe. But again, it's got rattlesnake plant and Calathea both put in there too.
Well, and to confuse it even further, there's a different Calathea that is sometimes called rattlesnake plant that has a much bigger flower that looks more like the rattle of a rattlesnake. So it's called rattlesnake plant because of the flower, whereas this one's called rattlesnake plant because of the leaf pattern. So plant names are confusing.
Exactly.
Oh, another confusing thing about the Guppertia genus is there were two other genuses named Guppertia after this one was named, and so they had to rename those. So like this guy Guppert was so popular at one point that people were trying to name genuses after him, and they had to settle it down. Oh, okay. I have two more things to say about this plant, and then we'll jump in with any other questions you have, of course. But I'm trying to get to the things off my list. Okay, first thing is my houseplant. I should have mentioned this at the beginning. So a number of episodes ago, I was talking to a guest about I forget what they named their plant. I'm sorry. There was a guest who was saying how she had named her plant after her grandfather because her grandfather was the first one to acquire it. It was a corn plant, and I started reading about why do people name plants. I'd never named my plants before. Do you name your plants?
No, actually.
Not everybody
I
does.
haven't thought about it, actually, but yeah.
So not everybody does, but I read a study, and it really stuck with me, that said that plants that have names are healthier. And it's not like it sounds very woo-woo, but it's really more that when humans name something, they tend to take care of them better.
Right, you make a connection, a more personal connection, yeah.
So I decided I should name all my houseplants, and I actually delegated that job to my wife, who's really good at it. So I showed her the rattlesnake plant. I said, "What is this plant's name?" And she said, "Tabitha." And so that is Tabitha, my rattlesnake plant.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to have to do something similar. I'll get my daughter over here and have her start labeling my plants with names.
Yeah.
She's good at doing that stuff.
Yeah, good idea.
I'll just have to learn them all.
Yeah, and your plants look really healthy, so maybe you don't need that trick, but that would be a good task for a kid to do. And then the last thing is going back to the prayer plant aspect of folding up. I was trying to figure out, well, why do they do that? right?
Right.
Like biologically, evolutionarily, what is the point of expending that energy to close up and open up?
Right.
Well, first of all, this habit, and there's a lot of plants that do this in slightly different ways, but that habit is called nyctinasty, which is a very fun word to say. It sounds like
Right.
something else that's got the word nasty in there.
Yeah.
But it is just this. It's just this thing of a plant moving with in like a day and night cycle in some way, and a lot of plants do that. This is one of the more obvious ones because it really goes from way out to straight up.
Yeah.
But I was reading about the mechanism. It's very complicated. The pulvinus, this modified petiole, the way that it moves and with chemical reactions. You can read the Wikipedia. It's very complicated. But even then, when it comes to why plants like the Calathea do that, we're not sure. Is number one. There's a lot of theories, but I think they haven't been able to figure out a way to test it. So one theory is that by having the leaves point up at nighttime, you are minimizing water loss when there is nothing to photosynthesize. So when you're like your leaves are out, you can photosynthesize, and so if you're losing water, that's a trade-off. But at nighttime, there's no sun, so why do you need to like show your leaves to lose water? But in the jungle, I don't think that matters as much. So maybe that's the reason for some plants, but not others. But then someone mentioned predator avoidance. And then it hit me. And if there's somebody out there who's studying Calatheas, please get at me, because this is what I think is the reason why this particular Calathea, this is my theory, completely unscientific, just me getting in the mind of this plant. I think in the daytime it needs to photosynthesize, so it needs to put its leaves out. But it has this really cool pattern of its leaves, which probably helps it blend in with the dappled light of the jungle, right?
Yeah.
It has this pattern in the front. But at nighttime, that's probably a detriment because those bright spots might draw attention to yourself.
Oh, yeah.
So it folds up, and then it has this very dark maroon, which is actually probably hard to see at night. And so various herbivores probably have a harder time spotting it because it kind of just cloaks itself. It goes into the shadow by putting up its leaves and only showing the dark maroon underside. So that's my theory, and it makes sense, but I'm not a plant expert, and I'm not a rattlesnake plant, so I really don't know what it's really doing. But that seems to make sense
Out
to
of
me.
the two theories, I would definitely buy the latter versus the former. So I like that idea. I think it makes a lot of sense.
There's one more theory which might apply to this one, and maybe it's a double action with my theory and this theory. There's one other theory that in the jungle, a lot of the plants exhibit this in a little bit different way of herbivore control, and the theory is at night, if a lot of the plants fold up, there's more open space for odors to travel and for sight lines, and so that herbivores are more vulnerable to their predators if all the plants fold up.
Right.
Which is another, I think, a really
Right.
interesting idea. They you get out of the way at nighttime so that they can avoid being eaten by herbivores. Because the herbivores are going to get eaten by their predators. So really, that's an interesting theory too. But yeah, I was really I thought this was interesting stuff.
It would be interesting to see, you'd have to, maybe take one out or take it out during a full moon or something like that, and kind of see what the leaves look like when the light's kind of bouncing off of them. Maybe they kind of reflect a little bit, or maybe there's something there, which makes me think again about that reasoning of plant predators or even other animals that would herbivores that would feed, I don't know, at night, but they would be really seen.
Yeah,
if the light was just right at night to kind of create a kind of a glowing effect.
Yeah, I was thinking of doing this. It'd be an interesting kind of experiment. I think it'd be, in my mind, I think it'd be very clear that if you went out at night and held up one leaf with the dots forward and one leaf with the dots, with the maroon side, I think the difference in of visibility would be shocking, right? And
exactly.
So it makes a lot of sense to be like, I gotta close these up at night when I don't need to photosynthesize.
Yeah, exactly. And again, too, and I'm also looking at the Maranta, the other prayer plant, and again, it's got a bunch of just really cool patterns and variegation and all of that, to where I can see in the same similar situation for that plant, again, if there's a certain amount of moonlight or something that just cracks through the forest or the jungle, wherever it's at, and those leaves were out, it would probably create a bunch of glowing or luminescence type of effect that could be, again, detrimental to the survival of the plant. So I would definitely buy into that reasoning.
Well, I'm glad that my theory sounds good to at least one person. Well, that's all I have to say about rattlesnake plant. But Enoch, do you mind sticking around for the last segment of the show? I have something to bring up, which we talked about on text earlier.
Absolutely. It sounds great to me.
I got a woman, she can't be beat. She's tailor-made and she heap too sweet. She's a rattlesnake in mama. She's a rattlesnake in mama. She's a rattlesnake in mama. She wants to rattle me all the time.
Okay, we're back here in the final segment of the show, and audience will know that the format of the show is I invite a guest, they tell me about a plant that's meaningful to them, and then I tell the guest about a plant that's meaningful to me. And it's a really great format. I like it a lot. But one of the challenges is that, especially as we get more shows, and we're up to 100 shows now, and with about 2 plants per episode, that's like 200 plants. A lot of the common plants are kind of getting taken, quote unquote. And an experience I've had with a few people is they mention a plant, I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, that's already been taken. Is there something else? And normally they tell me another plant. I'm like, hey, that's perfect. But Enoch, who's still here with us, he listed, we had to go through 3 other plants before we got to spider plant that were meaningful to him. And so I felt a little bit bad. And so I thought I would say, hey, Enoch, why don't you run through these 3 plants, which were pothos, corn plant, and sweet potato, and just tell us why those 3 are meaningful to you and why they popped into your head, because I'm always interested about that. And those 3 came before spider plant, which was a very touching story. So these other ones must also be pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And again, too, just luckily, I'm a lover of growing plants and green things. That I've got a ton of different varieties, and a lot of them are actually pretty meaningful to me. But the first one I mentioned to you, obviously, is very common. Pothos plant, lots of people, if you're growing them, again, too, comes down to the idea that they're easy to grow, really hardy, they'll, last forever. And that's pretty much the story of mine is that I've had it for over 25 years now.
Wow.
And before that, it probably lived in this restaurant for another 20 years.
Wow.
And this restaurant got bought out by some new people and threw out the old plants, and this thing was just dead. I mean, it would look like the most dead thing, but I saw this little green node poking out of the stem nearest the soil, and I asked him if I could take it home, and I did. And again, like I said, I've had it now for 25 plus years. It's grown around several different homes that I've lived in, and it's it grows in kind of like an ivy type of fashion, and probably, as you can see, but not everybody else, unfortunately, but wraps around my whole living room here. And if I actually wrapped it around completely straight out, it would probably wrap around twice in both directions. I imagine.
Wow.
It probably goes about 40 feet in both directions.
Wow.
Yeah. And
incredible.
And again, like I said, I've cut it back and moved it. Every time I've had to move before, I've had to cut it back, and because you just can't move 40 feet.
40 feet of vines.
Exactly. So I cut it back and it grows back again and everything. But it's really the one plant. Like I said, I've always had like a handful of them. But since, I was in my early 20s when I got this, I've kept this one, and it's come with me everywhere. And,
quick question is, what made you decide you wanted to take a little nub of a plant, like outside of a restaurant?
Again, I think it comes back to this idea that I was trying to hold on to these connections of my youth as I'm going into my adulthood or something. And I just moved to this city and started this job at this restaurant. And, I just got this new place. It didn't have any plants. It didn't have anything. And I think there was just something in me that says, I've grown enough plants before. I know enough about them. I can make this survive. I can bring this back to life. And that was kind of
Yeah.
the mission at first, was just, can I bring it back to life? Little did I know, again, like I said, I'd be it'll be trailing around with me for 25 plus years after that.
Amazing.
And again, in dozens of homes. So easy to propagate. You just cut, again, similar with the little nodes. They create roots. You start a whole new plant. I've given this plant to dozens of people over the years. So it's in dozens of different homes as well. So, I mean, what a life it's led, right?
Wow. Okay, what about sweet potato? That's another one you mentioned.
Oh, man. Again, coming back to my mom and early years of growing up, one of the other plants that just completely fascinated me was that we went to, and here's the thing, she loved showing me these lessons, Would take me to the store. We bought this sweet potato and take it home, and, she sticks some toothpicks in it or whatever it was, and puts it in this shallow bowl. And within like a couple of weeks, it's now sprouting these sprouts off of it, which create these whole new stems, which are basically called slips that we would replant into new plants. But she just let it grow out as a plant, so it had these big, long, sprawling slips growing off of it. And I just thought it was the coolest thing. And I, again, love plants. It was kind of really something that was just really inside of me, that when we were young, you remember back in school, you'd have show and tell. I made my mother grab up this thing and stick it in the car, travel it all the way down to my school, and so I could show it off to the class, because I thought it was just the coolest thing, that you could take a potato and a month or so later you have this big, cool, sprawling plant.
Yeah, I've done that once before. I've grown the slips, and I ended up planting a bunch of sweet potatoes from them. But yeah, I didn't realize it really becomes this kind of trailing vine too. And I keep thinking I should just do that for a house plant. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I think it probably would die back in the winter. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe you can keep it going.
Yeah, just depending on your conditions of your home. If you're keeping the conditions right, not allowing it to probably get too cold, I think in the sweet potato situation would be all right. But that's what she grew it for, was just this house plant. I didn't even know, Steve, until later on in my adulthood, that all of those stems, these slips that you could take them off and then produce whole new potatoes in the ground by growing them. I didn't learn that until I started vegetable gardening years and years later.
Did you know that the leaves are edible?
Yes, absolutely.
They're so good.
Yes, they are. Yeah, I have a friend who has a YouTube channel, and that's just one of her favorite things she talks about all the time, is sweet potatoes and the edible leaves, and that's what she eats most of, is the leaves versus the potatoes.
That's very interesting. I did, on my sweet potato episode, which I read about, basically tempura fried sweet potato leaves, which was really tasty.
Ooh, yeah,
so
that sounds good.
Okay, and then finally, corn plant. I talked about this back on episode 56 with Hillary, and she told us about her plant, which was named after her grandfather, and she had it for, I don't know, she said that the plant was pushing 100 years, but you also mentioned corn plant as a plant that was meaningful to you. So what's your story with corn plant, which, for the audience that don't know, it's actually not corn like the one we eat. It's like corn plant, which is I think a species of Dracaena, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, Dracaena fragrans. Yeah, and here again too with the Latin terms, but I knew Dracaena, but it wasn't until probably one of the coolest things that happens with a plant. We've talked about this: house plants, flowers. When house plants flowers, one of the coolest ones that I've ever had flower was the corn plant. And again, it's called Dracaena fragrans, and fragrance for a reason, because literally I saw this corn plant, and I've had a couple of them, and it was again, I have it right here next to me, but it had a flower popping out of the top of it that was starting to form, and I was like, oh wow, just fascinated, for one, that it's got this flower. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to keep an eye on that. And I remember I probably didn't think about it for another few days, and then I was coming home from work, and I walked in the house, and it was like getting, it's probably not the right word, but punched in the face with this amazing, and I mean it was amazing, fragrance. You know what I mean? I was like, what in the world is that? And I was looking around, and it took me a minute to remember, oh yeah, the corn plant was flowering. I went over to look at it, and it has this really, and it's an odd looking, it ain't the best looking flower, for sure. It got this a la cone type of flower, and then and actually what it is one of these flowers similar to a sunflower. Where it's not, we think of it as one big flower, but it's actually hundreds of different flowers, all in an array. So that's kind of what the flower is. It looks like one big flower, but it's actually like, I don't know, 30, 40, maybe 50 different little flowers. But they drip this kind of sap or whatever it is that it has the most amazing fragrance. And it's like I tell people is if you have a corn plant and you're lucky enough to see it flower, your neighbors are going to know that your corn plant is flowering because they'll be able to smell it. That's how much it is.
I'm pretty bad at describing smells, and I don't know if you are too, but any way you can describe like what it smelled like? That's a hard question.
It is kind of hard. The only other thing, and here's the thing, as far as like pungency and maybe some levels of similarity, is if you've ever had citrus and you've smelled citrus flowers. Now, and citrus does a very similar thing. It's just very fragrant. When they're flowering, you can smell it for a mile around, And so again, and I wouldn't say they're exactly similar, but if you think about that kind of pungency, that
ballpark.
And not only that, when you smell it, the way it makes you feel good. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It brightens your mind. It's like it puts a smile on your face. You know what I mean? It's really one of those great things that's just like, wow, what is that amazing smell,
I got to try to track down one of those flowering. So, well, that's really good. Thank you for sharing those 3 plants that meant something to you, and glad we could get those in, because I was like, every time you're messaging me, I was like, nope, covered. I feel like this is going to be a theme of the show. I got to figure out a way to solve this problem a little bit. Maybe this is one example, is having people come on and tell me about them in the last segment. Just one last thing is, I was on Enoch's show, which is Let's Get Growing. Now, we haven't recorded it yet, but because of the magic of time travel, that has been recorded and is available. So there'll be a link to that in the show notes of this show. And I'm sure it was a really good time on Let's Get Growing with
it was a great conversation. It was great.
It hasn't happened yet, but it was awesome. Yeah,
it was awesome.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Enoch. I'll speak to you in a couple days, and then time travel.
That's right. Let's all time travel together.
My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Enoch Graham. Enoch is the host of the Urban Gardener channel and the Let's Get Growing Weekend Gardening Livecast. You can learn more about both at letsgetgrowing.live. And also, as I mentioned before, I was on a recent episode. There will be a link to that one in the show notes. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the different ways you can help support the show, including sending me a message. The email is rootboundpodcast@gmail.com. Rootbound is hosted by Petiolate podcaster Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegesgota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, don't forget to water your houseplants first.
Black locust! I know it sounds like some kind of bug, but really, it's a tree.